Previously on the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point. Toho Studios pursues a Godzilla anime television series with Polygon Pictures, but after the monstrous success of Shin Godzilla, they turned the project into a trilogy of motion pictures to capitalize on the King of the Monsters' newfound popularity. But the dream of a Godzilla anime series doesn't die. Toho restarts their efforts by partnering with animation studios Bones and Orange, who hire anime veteran Atsushi Takahashi to direct. But after months of not finding a satisfactory setup, Takahashi eyes a prolific science fiction author who he believes will be able to bring his new creative vision to life. Singular Point is the latest Japanese entry of the Godzilla franchise, and it internationally debuted on Netflix this past summer. The video that you are about to watch will be exploring the very long journey it took to craft the narrative of this show. From its origins that predate Shin Godzilla, through the twists and turns it took the production staff to finally crack the general outline. You will also be hearing from several experts and enthusiasts alike: Kevin Derendorf, LeMay, Patrick Galvan, and Monstrosities livestream regular Rainey, who will be offering key insight and knowledge into the worlds of both anime and Godzilla productions. But before we do this, I have to ask, please subscribe to Monstrosities Tokusatsu Vlog. It is undeniably through the huge support of subscribers like you that allow us to continue to make videos like these. Now, with that said, please sit back and enjoy the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point. Toh EnJoe is a multiple award-winning science fiction author, has a PhD in mathematical physical study on the natural languages, and graduated from Tohoku University as a physicist.
I love this quote from the literary journal Asymptote. Toh EnJoe's stories are known for their scientific lucidity and literary impenetrability. His language and writing style, however, belie his background as a physicist. Topics woven into his stories include science, but also linguistics, literary theory, and philosophical approaches to the imagination. His complicated narrative structures are the subject of heated discussions and have evoked harsh reviews calling his work indigestible, sleep-inducing, and reader-unfriendly. And I can't disagree with any of that.
I feel like in order to understand an EnJoe work, you sort of either need to be EnJoe himself or need to have the same background in science and literature as him. It's kind of perfect that EnJoe entered the anime industry as a writer because there's a deep, definite niche that he can fill that few others can. It's a little hard to explain, but many anime fans tend to love series that go deep into scientific exposition and philosophical musings. It's one of the reasons that Ghost in the Shell and Neon Genesis Evangelion have continued to stay popular. And EnJoe even wrote a tie-in collection of short stories for Ghost in the Shell.
Though he had some experience in the manga field with the Empire of Corpses, he hadn't any screenwriting experience until the president of Studio Bones, Masahiko Minami, called him to work on a few episodes of the space set series Space Dandy. Upon first being asked, EnJoe expressed no interest. But then, Mr. Minami asked me to come to Tokyo for a while, and when I went there, I couldn't say no anymore. Space Dandy had also been a show Atsushi Takahashi worked on as a storyboard artist and director. Takahashi, impressed with EnJoe's work on Space Dandy, even asked the writer to pen his 2017 Doraemon movie, but EnJoe declined. Now, with the Godzilla project at hand, Takahashi truly believed that EnJoe's inclusion would make things interesting. So, at his request, in July of 2017, Masahiko Minami once again phoned EnJoe with a question. How do you feel about Godzilla? Intrigued, EnJoe traveled once again to Tokyo where he met with the project's staff. Their offer was for EnJoe to act as a series composer, a key writing position that would formulate the overall story concept and key moments within the anime series. EnJoe would also act as a sort of science advisor, because director Takahashi had decided to take a contemporary science fiction approach to the story. Mr. Takahashi wanted us to have a solid science fiction foundation, EnJoe told Gigazine.net. He thought it was time to stop saying that the monsters became huge after being exposed to radiation. History was about to repeat itself. As EnJoe sat there, surrounded by the Godzilla anime staff, I was like, isn't there any way out of this? I felt like I was being summoned. And I said, I have to do this, don't I? EnJoe laughed. EnJoe accepted the job, and for the next 3 years, he and Takahashi would contemplate and design their Godzilla story. Many of these scenarios, as you'll soon hear, aren't just overly familiar copy-paste plots featuring Godzilla. There's usually some small complexity or intriguing angle. However, there was one concept that Toh EnJoe has mentioned on multiple occasions, and this idea sounds way less like a Takahashi EnJoe joint and more like another early studio pitch, and it was something that neither director or series composer thought was a good idea. Popularized from Ultraman to Neon Genesis Evangelion, the Kaiju of the Week scenario is a well-worn story format, and it was proposed early on that the new Godzilla anime series should take such a direction.
Anime, as it currently stands, in a way came out of tokusatsu traditions. If you look at Devilman and Cutie Honey and Mazinger Z, those are all Monster of the Week shows because those were emulating the popular Monster of the Week shows that were on, like Ultraman and Kamen Rider. There's been a move away from that, starting in the 80s, towards a more serialized approach to television, where a threat might recur over multiple episodes. And you see this both in the tokusatsu world and in animation.
So Demon Slayer and Jujutsu Kaisen are two of the more popular ones that do that sort of thing, where they have to face a new enemy every few episodes. So it's not Monster of the Week, but Monster of the every few weeks.
As tokusatsu still has a little bit of a younger skewing audience, it tends to be a little bit more Monster of the Week still, and animation tends to be a little bit more serialized now. But it's very much a retro thing to have the idea of a Monster of the Week. So if you look at shows that are throwbacks, a great example would be The Big O in that first season. Every episode is very self-contained because it's trying to emulate the feeling of a classic sort of 60s era television show.
On the Kaiju of the Week idea, EnJoe said, "Neither me or Mr. Takahashi liked it." He further elaborated on his problems with it in his interview with Gigazine.net. The show can be structured as a series of short stories, since each story has to end in 30 minutes. It's just a question of how to make it. 13 episodes is very difficult. If you're talking about Ultra monsters, you can have one monster per episode and have it be defeated by Ultraman. But in Godzilla, for example, if Rodan comes out and is defeated in the first episode, and then Anguirus comes out and is defeated in the second episode, people will say, it's not supposed to be like this. The Kaiju of the Week idea would also go against EnJoe and Takahashi's creative desire to keep Godzilla from appearing too much within the series. "I thought it would be boring if Godzilla appeared every 2 episodes or 6 times out of 13 episodes," EnJoe stated to Asahi.com, further elaborating that an Ultraman or Evangelion type approach would be difficult to structure.
Toho EnJoe thought that the idea of a Monster of the Week was boring. And if the writer thinks that something will be boring, if they're going to be the one writing it, it will be boring.
Monster of the Week shows tend to focus more on the development of the characters, and that probably wouldn't have left much room for EnJoe to explore the science of the series. And I think he likes having characters that are already smart enough to handle the roles they're given rather than develop into those roles.
I wholeheartedly agree with the idea that it would have been kind of boring if it was just a Monster of the Week type show. Because as much as I love Ultraman, and I'll usually watch all of them, it does get a little bit repetitive.
A Monster of the Week show can still be done very, very well. And in cases of programs like Ultraman, they tend to be some of the most memorable episodes that just stand on their own and have their own start and ending and have a distinct message and moral and artistic vision behind them. It's much more difficult from a production standpoint to come up with multiple stories that are all going to be unique and interesting, when instead you can have one overarching narrative that you stretch over several episodes.
If it had been, the Monster of the Week, that probably would have made a lot of fans happier, certain types of fans, but I enjoyed the mystery of Singular Point. That's more what I'm into when it comes to a TV show, so I'm glad that's what they did.
It is entirely possible that this Kaiju of the Week pitch was the same one that director Takahashi had heard in his initial job interview, that being the scenario involving Godzilla fighting monsters worldwide. But one would have to believe that story dead after Takahashi's disinterest in it, the subsequent creation of other story proposals, and the hiring of Toh EnJoe to help with the series' new sci-fi direction. But by the time EnJoe joined the production, the idea had either survived, had been reworked, or was just an entirely new, similar-sounding concept. Whatever the case, neither key creative thought much of it, and they moved on in trying to find the right tale to tell. How many times the Godzilla anime team would meet to discuss the direction of the story is up to debate. Director Takahashi told Uchisen magazine that they had 2 or 3 training camps to work out the plot. Meanwhile, series composer EnJoe recounted that he, director Takahashi, producer Yoshizawa, and the heads of Studio Bones and Orange met every 2 weeks at Toho Studios. Upon his second meeting with director Takahashi, EnJoe was presented with the director's creative vision for the Godzilla anime series, a proper sci-fi story like the movie Arrival, which had just been recently released in Japan. I told him that Godzilla would never be like Arrival. If you think about it, Godzilla can't be like Arrival, can it? EnJoe mused in his Gigazine.net interview. After some back and forth discussion, we decided, well, let's think in that direction. It's not like we were trying to work out the details then, EnJoe laughed. The sci-fi feel of Arrival would be a key ingredient in formulating the final setting and story for Godzilla Singular Point. The other key ingredients would be a puzzle-like mystery for the characters to solve, and a highly realistic feel overall. Were these ideas initially pitched by Takahashi from the start, along with the sci-fi feel of Arrival? Or did director and story composer gradually stumble across them somewhere over the 3 years of developing Singular Point's story? It's really hard to say. For this video, we're going with the idea that they gradually came across each key story point and fleshed it out as they went along. With that said, from the start, alongside the idea of having an Arrival-like sci-fi feel, was Takahashi's desire for a puzzle-like mystery to be present. Mr. Takahashi said, "I want it to be like Pulp Fiction." He said we wanted to combine those puzzle-like elements. It was a combination of the feeling of Arrival and some of the stories from Pulp Fiction, but it all ended up in one place, Toh EnJoe recalled. Takahashi requested that EnJoe come up with as many ideas as he possibly could. From there, the two would then consider how each idea could be visualized and if the idea could be made into an entertaining scenario. "We had many ideas for the series," Takahashi said in the Godzilla Singular Point fanbook. But the process was difficult. For one, since so much had already been done with the nearly 70-year-old Godzilla franchise, coming up with new ideas was challenging. And secondly, director Takahashi was in a constant game of tug-of-war with his series composer. The director has a very careful style. "When I try to go too far, Mr. Takahashi pulls me back to sanity while playing tug-of-war with me," EnJoe said to Uchusen magazine. In that same issue of Uchusen, Takahashi explained that Mr. EnJoe would come up with ideas that could never be visualized. One can only imagine what kind of crazy, impossible scenarios EnJoe dreamt up, but we may know of at least one. A Godzilla anime without Godzilla. If we are to take Toh EnJoe at his word, this was an idea that actually had some discussion behind it at one point. There are absolutely no details about this outside of a pair of quotes from EnJoe about the matter. "There was a proposal not to show him," EnJoe laughed during his interview with New Type magazine. "There was an idea in the beginning that Godzilla may not appear, but we decided not to do that this time," EnJoe told Yahoo News Japan.
I don't think you can have a Godzilla anime without Godzilla in it. I mean, he's right there in the title.
I kind of love the idea of doing a Godzilla movie in which Godzilla doesn't actually appear. I think that this is something that could be done quite well because the world in which Godzilla inhabits has so many kooky, off-the-wall things going on, and there's so many things that can be extrapolated from the notions of what would happen if we had monsters running around, what would happen if we had aliens that we had to fight wars against and be diplomatic with, and so on and so forth.
I wonder if it's more likely they meant something along the lines of like a spin-off where it would feature a lot of Toho monsters other than Godzilla. Even though they weren't great, I loved the idea that Toho did that Mothra trilogy in the late 90s. I just loved that they did it, even though the movies weren't that good. I'm supportive of the idea if it was like meant to enrich the Godzilla universe.
There have been some examples in the past, like the 1998 movie, The Great Monster Makes Landfall in Tokyo, is a kaiju movie where no kaiju actually do appear.
A riot is an ugly thing, and I think that it is just about time that we had one!
That said, I think that fandom would receive this very, very poorly and generally speaking would not like it. You would have a few people that were on board for something like that. But usually when the general audience goes to something called Godzilla, they get restless when Godzilla is not on screen.
Again, we can only speculate what this idea might have looked like, let alone as to why it was considered in the first place. But here is something to think about. Both director Takahashi and series composer EnJoe have discussed in various interviews how difficult they found it to properly time the appearance of Godzilla in their 13-episode series. They have even gone as far as calling it the most challenging part in developing the story. In a movie, Godzilla should appear at the height of the story, but if you apply that theory to the TV series, you'll end up with a lot of stories without Godzilla. It was difficult to find a balance between the two. Takahashi told Uchisan Magazine, "Could EnJoe's no Godzilla scenario have been an out-of-the-box solution to their creative dilemma? We don't know when to show Godzilla in the stories, so what if we just don't show Godzilla at all?" EnJoe did have less extreme ideas, of course, like the one where Godzilla would go around Japan destroying famous monuments. There was also talk of having the story set in a very familiar Japanese setting. Director Takahashi confirmed to Uchisan Magazine that Toho EnJoe proposed the idea of setting the Godzilla anime at a school. Again, details are scarce, but EnJoe told Yahoo News Japan that in the story, Godzilla would act as a typhoon, a disaster that would come about once a year. "I insisted on the story seriously, but I didn't get a very good reception," EnJoe said, laughing.
Schools are actually a hugely pervasive setting in Japanese animation, to an extent more than any other country's media that I've seen.
It is absolutely a very omnipresent thing throughout the course of Japanese media. And it's really interesting looking at the history of Japanese films, seeing how the classroom setting has been used. I'm thinking mainly in terms of the 1940s. During the time of the war, you had Japanese films that were set in the classroom, in which the teacher-student relationship was being used to help young people become ready to serve the nation. There was films like Shimizu Hiroshi's Introspection Tower about problem kids being sent to a reform school. And you have scenes in that film like, the kids giving their morning pledges, talking about serving the emperor. And also you have that sort of classroom setting appearing in a very different kind of way in the very explicit wartime propaganda films. Films like Toward the Decisive Battle in the Sky, The War at Sea from Hawaii to Malaya, for example. Flashing forward to the back half of the 1940s, this is Japan has surrendered and you now have the occupation. More importantly, you have the occupation trying to quote-unquote democratize the nation. And part of that whole strategy was the censorship of Japanese media, including films. And so now we have the occupation censors recommending democratic subjects and democratic topics to the filmmakers. I'm thinking in particular of a two-part film from 1947, I think, called Blue Mountains, directed by Imai Tadashi, and starring Hara Setsuko. Hara Setsuko in this film plays a democratic teacher who works in a town that has very antiquated ways of thinking, read pre-World War II ways of thinking, especially about young women and their relationship to boys. And so here comes this vibrant young teacher who's telling her students and telling their parents and the community, hey, it's okay for young girls to have relationships and so on and so forth. Very democratic ideas being pushed for by the occupation, and you have films, again, using the classroom setting to push that idea.
There's definitely a strong youth culture in Japan where the idea is that once you're an adult, you kind of get a salaryman job or you settle down and become a stay-at-home mom. So the idea is that the time of your life is really during your school years.
It's not just universally relatable for viewers, but you can also play around with the genres quite a lot. A sports show can easily take place in a high school, or you can change the school to have a focus on teaching magic for a fantasy series. Having a series set in a school can also be convenient to force different types of personalities together that normally wouldn't be near each other, which is good for creating friction and drama.
So the idea of Godzilla popping up like a force of nature to terrorize the area around a certain school, I can't tell you how much I hate that idea. It sounds like it would even be a hard sell for me as just a little IDW comic miniseries. And I'm not saying I always have to see Godzilla fighting other monsters, but, I'm a little tired of, Godzilla, he's just a force of nature and here he comes. And that's why I like Singular Point. There was a lot of mystery as to what he is and what he's going to do, how are they going to defeat him. Definitely don't like the school concept.
When going with anime as your choice of medium, I think it makes sense to go with one of the cliched archetypes that you'd see in Japanese animation, which is usually the high school students, rather than your usual tokusatsu staples, a reporter, a scientist, etc., etc. I think that the idea of Godzilla appearing on an annual basis is actually very reminiscent of a game called Attack of the Friday Monsters, which is sort of a mystery set in a small town where the main characters are trying to figure out why monsters attack every week, specifically on a Friday. It's very kind of a fun deconstruction of the whole Ultraman format.
I'm not too sure about the idea of Godzilla as a yearly natural disaster in that sort of setting. For EnJoe in particular, I think it would have forced him to do a lot more character development and taken away from the science, as I said before. So I don't think he would have enjoyed that either.
EnJoe addressed that one of the problems with the school setting was by having the characters be too young, it would be challenging to the narrative that they were trying to create. This is why they were eventually updated to college age in the final draft of Singular Point's story. One also wonders if nostalgia maybe played any role in EnJoe dreaming up the school setting. He had been in junior high when he saw his first Godzilla movie, Godzilla 1984 after all, and the film left a strong impression on him. But if nostalgia didn't have a role in that idea's creation, it certainly did with the next one. Takahashi and EnJoe turn to the past and present to finally cement their Godzilla anime idea in the final installment of the lost and unmade history of Godzilla Singular Point.